All right, so we're now into the second part of this lecture where we're describing Professor Dolgoff's basic schema for how we should be going about examining our selected social welfare policies and programs, and in turn, how we should be communicating our understanding of how these policies and programs work to an educated audience. And so we're provided a number of recommendations on how to go about discussing these topics. And so first, Professor Dolgoff notes that we should comment on the basic structural components of our chosen policies and programs. And by basic components, what he's referring to there are the needs and goals of the program. You should identify what the needs and goals of the program are. You should talk about the financing that goes into the program in question. You should talk about the eligibility structure and the benefit structure. Those things are often related. You should also comment on the level of administration. At what level is your program being administered? That's a note that you'll want to make in your papers. And so these are the basic dimensions that you'll want to comment on with respect to each of your policies and programs. And then, aside from these core dimensions, there are some alternative characteristics that you'll want to make note of in your papers with respect to each of your policies and programs. And so we're provided a number of dimensions. I've selected out 3 of those dimensions here that I'd like you to comment on. First is a distinction between residual philosophy or institutional philosophy. Does your selected program or policy, does it reflect residual principles or institutional principles? Does it reflect selective principles or universal principles? Similarly, right, you want to make that sort of distinction, and then you'll want to characterize your program as either being public in nature or private in nature. These are the basic characterizations that you want to make with respect to your chosen topics. Now, aside from these basic discussions, you'll want to also provide a quick evaluation of your chosen policies and programs. Now, this could be as simple as offering just some of the advantages and disadvantages of the way that your program is designed. And within that discussion, you can also comment on the adequacy of the services that are being provided, both in the way of horizontal and vertical adequacy. And so I'll talk through in more detail what we mean by each of these dimensions. So first, in the way of the first basic dimension is we're talking about the needs and goals of the program. So certainly one of the first discussions that you'll want to have in your papers is about the needs and goals of the program. So just by virtue of the fact that you've selected topics, at this point, you may have selected child maltreatment, hunger, or nutrition. You may have selected human trafficking or some other topic. So just by virtue of the fact that you've selected some topic, you've probably identified one of the key issues or societal needs or problems to be addressed by your eventual selected policy or program. And so the basic point here that Professor Dolgoff was making was that each program or policy that you've selected has some key objective in mind in the way of addressing societal needs and problems. And so there might be some additional goals or objectives behind your chosen policies and programs. Namely, it's just a different way to think about how your program has been designed. And so it may not be around a particular societal need or problem, but it may be around very specific objectives or goals to be achieved by the program. And so there might be a more narrow objective. There might be a narrow objective around economic security. There might be a very narrow objective around providing childcare. Right? You can frame that discussion in a different way. You can frame this discussion in that particular way. And note also that you can broaden the discussion to talk about broader objectives behind your program. So the Head Start program comes to mind. So when we're thinking about Head Start, this is providing assistance to low-income families and their kids who are younger than age 5. Right? And so there might be a basic objective to provide education to young kids, but there might be broader objectives. You might also comment on some of the broader objectives, namely provide socialization, provide quality of life, better quality of life or long-term quality of life to its recipients or its participants. And so the basic point here is that you want to comment on both the narrow objectives and also the broader objectives behind your program. Professor Dolgoff offers up a quick caveat here in this in the way of this discussion. So you'll want to make note about both the explicit objectives and the underlying or implicit objectives behind your chosen policy or program. And so, as an example, we're talking about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, where if you were to go online and look up this program, certainly there's going to be some explicit objectives, namely in the way of providing nutrition assistance. We want to address hunger and malnutrition. That's what the program will state on its website. But of course, Professor Dolgoff makes the argument that there might be some underlying objectives, namely that is government may be attempting to control people's behavior in the way of what they can or can't buy, or how they can actually use that benefit. And so the basic point here is that you'll want to comment on both the explicit objectives, which are much easier to identify, and then of course you'll need to read between the lines to identify the implicit objectives that might pertain to your topics as well. All right, so other dimensions. So we'll want to make note about the benefit that's offered, both in terms of the nature of the benefit that's offered and also the level of the benefit. So in terms of the nature of the benefit, most notably, you'll probably be commenting on whether benefits are provided in cash or in-kind assistance. Right? So is there cash assistance being provided, or is there some other type of benefit? In-kind assistance. By in-kind assistance, of course, we're talking about non-cash assistance in the way of housing, health insurance, near cash for that, so food stamps. We just got done talking about food stamps. So food stamps would be an example of in-kind assistance or near cash assistance. So you'll want to identify the basic form of the benefit that's being offered. And then, of course, you want to comment on the level of the benefit, right, or the adequacy of the benefit. Right? So if it's cash assistance, what's the level of the benefit that's being offered? If it's counseling being offered, what's the adequacy, what's the sufficiency of that benefit that's being offered? You'll want to make note of both dimensions there. And then, of course, we're just providing a number of different examples. Different programs, unemployment insurance, if we're to identify the key benefit that's being offered under unemployment insurance, certainly we would characterize it as being cash assistance. Social service agency, and the nature of the services being provided, you might have individual and or family counseling or group counseling. A housing program like the housing voucher program, it might be a voucher, right? Not necessarily housing per se, but it might be a voucher that's being provided. And so you want to make note about the nature, specific form of the benefit that's being offered is the point here. All right, so certainly you'll want to make note about the eligibility requirements for your chosen policies and programs. How does it work, right? So what sort of risks or what sort of categories are covered? What sort of risks are being covered by your chosen policies or programs? That's the nature of the discussion in this section. So we're provided a number of different examples here. So SNAP, right? So SNAP eligibility. If you were discussing that particular program, you'd comment on the poverty guidelines, how there's a net income threshold of 130%. There's a gross income threshold of 100%. You'll want to get into that sort of discussion as one example. If you're talking about community mental health services, right? So there might be a requirement that you have to live within a certain census area or census district to be provided services by that agency, and so you'll want to provide that discussion in your eligibility section. Other programs, we have Medicare, Social Security, a number of different criteria. Medicare, 3 different pathways into Medicare eligibility. You'll want to note the different categories of persons that qualify if you were taking on that topic. Social Security, you may want to make a note about how one becomes eligible on the basis of contributions over time. So there's a 10-year period over which you would accumulate credits. You would probably undertake that sort of discussion. And then of course, the topic of daycare as an example here. So daycare, at the state level at least, there's very little in the way of daycare that's typically provided by our state governments. But if your program is still intact, here in Illinois at least, we're provided daycare for 0 to 3 currently, and so we've cut services for 4 and 5-year-olds. And so you may want to make a comment about how one becomes eligible if you're under the age of 4, for example, as an eligibility requirement. And so these are just different examples that Professor Dolgoff and I are providing in the way of talking about eligibility requirements for your chosen topics. Okay, and so a quick note here about the importance of this discussion about eligibility and about the benefit structure. A quick point here is that this really needs to be accurate, right? So this is sometimes quite technical in nature, but this really has to be on point if you want a strong discussion, a strong overall discussion of your projects. All right, so certainly there are additional dimensions, a couple additional dimensions here that you'll want to comment on. Notably, we're talking about financing and levels of administration. So we've talked about financing in other contexts, and so Professor Dolgoff notes various dimensions or various ways in which programs or policies get funded. He talks about general revenue financing. He talks about dedicated financing. So these are terms that we've heard before. He talks about payroll taxes or employer-employee taxes. He talks about sliding scales and how those are used. He talks about combinations of these. So you'll want to identify specifically how the funding works for your chosen policies or programs. That's the major point here. And so we're just going through each of these different examples here. So we know we've talked about general revenue funding in the context of public assistance programs versus social insurance programs. Now, just note here that when we talk about general revenue funding, we might not be talking about governments per se, but about organizations. Your units of analysis may be different. And so if we're talking about organizations as opposed to government, there might be a way in which general revenue funding applies to your chosen agency or organization. Namely, let's say you have an organization like the Alzheimer's Association. And the way in which they generate revenue is through donations. If that's their major way of generating revenue, if they're using that revenue for general purposes, we might categorize that as being general revenue financing, much like we might categorize general taxes and that revenue being generated in the way of public assistance in providing benefits for public assistance programs. We might characterize the government as being provided with general revenue funding. So we have different units of analysis. I'm just making a point that these terms may apply to organizations and not only to government. And then, of course, we have dedicated or earmarked taxes. We've talked about in the context of characterizing social insurance programs. That's what we typically think of when we're talking about social insurance. But aside from government, again, we might be talking about agencies or organizations and characterizing them as being dedicated, as using their revenues in the way of dedicated or earmarked financing. And so to go back to our example about the Alzheimer's Association, it could be that once they generate their revenue in the way of donations, maybe they're using their donations for research purposes, in which case that might be a more streamlined financing mechanism, right? So we have a more dedicated or earmarked funding stream in that instance, and so we're applying that term to the level of organizations is my quick point here. All right, and then of course we have payroll taxes, another way in which entities, both at the governmental level and both the private or organizational level, will generate their revenue. And then of course this last point here is about payments by the recipients themselves. Namely, we talk about sliding scale fees and how people who have higher income levels might be paying more for services than people with lower income levels. That's what we mean by a sliding scale. And so many nonprofit organizations are characterized by sliding scale fees. And so Professor Dolgoff notes this method of revenue generation for nonprofit entities. All right, and then lastly here is in the way of talking about levels of administration. This is basically a discussion about federalism and the nature of relationships between federal, state, and local governments. And so we just want to make a comment about at what level is your policy or program being administered? Is it administered at the state level? Is it the federal level? Or maybe there's a combination, both the federal and state governments might be administering your programs. And so Professor Dolgoff provides an example of our welfare system, how it's provided at both the federal and state level. So the federal government makes a lump sum payment or makes a block grant payment to the states, and the states administer the program. And so the quick point here is that there might be a combination of different levels of administration for your chosen policies and programs. All right, lastly, we're looking at alternative characteristics of our chosen policies and programs. And so first we have residual philosophy and institutional philosophy, these terms that connote the nature of the program in question as being ingrained in our society. So in the case of residual philosophy, we're talking about programs that we think of as a last resort. Right? Residual meaning last resort. So when all other structures have broken down, right? So we have programs as a last resort. In other words, this is reflecting residual philosophy that our social welfare institutions should come into play only as a last resort, only when the normal structures have broken down. That's what we mean by residual philosophy. And then on the other hand, we have institutional philosophy, which is saying that there are some services in our society that we've come to expect as a matter of right. And so they've become so ingrained in our culture that they've become institutional in nature. And so that's what we mean by institutional philosophy. And so when we think about public assistance programs, typically these are safety net programs. And so you can see how they reflect residual thinking. And then, of course, we have our social insurance programs where anyone could potentially benefit. And so, of course, that reflects institutional thinking where we've come to expect those benefits almost as a matter of right over our social insurance history. All right, and then we want to make a distinction about selective principles or universal principles that are reflected in our chosen policies and programs. And so if there's a means test, if there's an income test, a test of income and assets, most likely you're talking about a selective program if anyone can potentially benefit under your policy or program, then we probably have a universal program. And so you want to make that characterization. Of course, there's alignment here between selectivity and universality with this notion of residual and institutional thinking, and so you want to make that connection. And then Professor Dolgoff notes one quick caveat here in the way of some programs and how they might be characterized as both selective and universal. And so as an example, he says that our financial assistance programs, our federal financial assistance programs may be characterized as both in the sense that you have to have low income. Often for our programs, you have to have low income to qualify, but then they're still available to all students, and so they might have elements of both selective and universal thinking, is the point in that discussion. All right, and then one final dimension here is between public entities and private entities. There's different ways to think about these terms, public versus private. You might be thinking about the home versus outside the home, but here, of course, we're making a distinction between government entities and non-government entities, namely in the private sector. And so that's the major distinction that you want to make. Is your program or policy in question, is it something that's within the private sector, or is it within the government sector? And if it is within the private sector, you'll want to characterize it. Professor Dolgoff notes that we can make a further distinction here between private for-profit entities and private non-profit entities. And that just depends on how that company or that organization was formed. Is there a 501c3 filing, which in that case would be a non-profit entity? Or is there a profit motive? Is it structured as a profit-generating entity, in which case it would be private for-profit? The more important distinction here is between the public sector and the private sector. And if you want to go beyond that, you can certainly do so in the way of distinguishing between private for-profit and private non-profit. All right, and then the last part of your papers, you'll want to comment on the advantages and disadvantages with respect to your chosen policies and programs. And one way to do this, Professor Dolgoff provides us one tool by which we can evaluate, or one criterion by which we can evaluate our chosen policies and programs, and that's in the way of adequacy. And he talks about both horizontal adequacy and vertical adequacy. And so by horizontal adequacy, he's referring to the reach of a program. So is the program in question, is it reaching its intended audience, is the basic issue there. And then with respect to vertical adequacy, he's talking about the depth or the quality of the services that are being provided by that agency. And so as one quick example, if we're talking about the Alzheimer's Association once again, say the Alzheimer's Association is reaching out to persons with Alzheimer's disease, so persons with the disease, but are they reaching caregivers as well, right? Are their outreach efforts being limited to just persons with disease, or are they also reaching out to the caregivers? That might be one issue that you bring up in a discussion about horizontal adequacy. And then in terms of vertical adequacy, you might want to make a note about the quality of the services being provided. What sort of services are being provided by the agency in question, by the Alzheimer's Association? Are they providing information and referral for persons with Alzheimer's disease, or do they go beyond that basic service to provide counseling for the caregivers? Do they provide a service that tracks wandering persons who wander in the middle of the night? And so you're providing some commentary about the quality or the depth of services being provided by your chosen agency or organization. All right, so that concludes this lecture, the second part of the week 6 lecture.